He would have felt exactly like this if plaster of Paris had been poured between his muscles. His eyes were wide open, but why was it so dark? He wondered. Somewhere a mouse seemed to be dragging along the makings of a nest. His throat smarted painfully as though a file had been passed through it. Gas rose in belches from his intestines as if from some cesspool. He wanted to smoke. No, before that, he wanted a drink of water. Water! At once he was drawn back to reality. Then it hadn't been a mouse, but the woman who had begun working. My God, how long had he been asleep? He tried to get up, but a terrible weight forced him back on the mattress. Remembering, he snatched the towel from his face. From the open doorway, a wan, cool moonlight was streaming in, as if through gelatin. Suddenly, it was night again. The kettle, lamp, and bottle of cheap sake stood beside his pillow. He raised himself at once on one elbow and rinsed out his mouth, spitting the water into the sunken fireplace. Slowly, relishing the feeling, he moistened his throat. He felt around the lamp, and his hand touched a soft package and some cigarettes and matches. He lit the lamp and put a match to the cigarette. Then cautiously, he tried a mouthful of cheap sake. The scattered faculties slowly began to arrange themselves. The contents of the package consisted of a boxed lunch, 3 balls of rice mixed with wheat, which were still warm, 2 skewers of dried sardines, some dry, wrinkled radish pickle, and some boiled vegetable that had a bitter taste. The vegetable seemed to be dried radish leaves. He could only eat 1 of the skewers of sardines and 1 rice ball. His stomach felt like a cold rubber glove. When he stood up, his joints creaked like the wind howling over the zinc roof. Nervously, he peered into the water jar. It had been replenished and was brimming full. He dampened the towel and wiped his face. A shiver went through his whole body like a fluorescent light. He washed his neck and flanks and shook the sand from between his fingers. Maybe he should be satisfied with creature comforts and let the rest go. "Shall I fix you some tea?" The woman was standing in the doorway. "No, thanks. My stomach is too queasy as it is." "Did you sleep well?" "You should have got me up when you got up." The woman bent her head, giggling. "Actually, I got up 3 times during the night and fixed a towel over your face." She had the coquetry of a 3-year-old who had just learned to use an adult's laugh. It was obvious she did not know how best to express her cheerful feelings or her embarrassment. He felt depressed and turned his eyes away. "Shall I help you with the digging, or would it be better if I did the carrying?" "Well, it's about time for the next basket lift to come." When he actually began to work, for some reason, he did not resist it as much as he thought he would. What could be the cause of this change, he wondered. Was it the fear that the water would be discontinued? Was it because of his indebtedness to the woman? Or something about the character of the work itself? Work seemed something fundamental for man, something which enabled him to endure the aimless flight of time. Once he had been taken along. When was it? By the Mobius man to a lecture meeting. The meeting place was completely surrounded by a low, rusty fence, and within the enclosure the surface of the ground was almost invisible beneath paper refuse, empty boxes, and rags of indiscriminate origin. What had ever put it into the designer's head to place such a fence around the site? Whereupon, as though his thoughts had materialized, a man in a tired suit of clothes appeared, leaning over the iron fence, earnestly trying to scrape it with his fingertips. His Mobius friend had informed him that it was a plain-clothes man. Then, on the ceiling of the meeting place, there was a huge coffee-colored leaky spot the like of which he had never seen before. In the midst of all this, the lecturer was speaking. "The only way to go beyond work is through work. It is not that work itself is valuable. We surmount work by work. The real value of work lies in the strength of self-denial. He heard the sharp signal of someone whistling through his fingers. Then there were carefree shouts and people running up, dragging the baskets. As usual, as they drew nearer they became quiet, and the basket was lowered in silence. He could feel that he was under close observation, but it would be of no use now to yell at the cliff. When the specified amount of sand had been safely hoisted, the tension relaxed, and even the feel of the air seemed to change. No one said anything, but it seemed that for a moment they had come to an agreement. He could see a very definite change in the woman's attitude, too. "Let's have a break. I'll bring some tea." Her voice and her behavior, too, were more cheerful. She was brimming over with an uncontainable zest. The man felt sated, as if he had eaten too much sugar. As she passed him, he brought himself to pat her buttocks from behind. If the voltage is too high, the filament burns out. Never had he intended to deceive her like this. Sometime he would tell her the story of the guard who protected the imaginary castle. There was a castle. No, it wasn't necessarily a castle. It could be anything. A factory, a bank, a gambling house. So the guard could be either a watchman or a bodyguard. Now the guard, always prepared for the enemy attack, never failed in his vigilance. One day, the long-expected enemy finally came. This was the moment, and he rang the alarm signal. Strangely enough, however, there was no response from the troops. Needless to say, the enemy easily overpowered the guard in one fell swoop. In his fading consciousness, he saw the enemy sweeping like the wind through the gates, over the walls, and into the buildings unhindered by anyone. No, it was the castle, not the enemy, that was really like the wind. The single guard, like a withered tree in the wilderness, had stood guarding an illusion. He sat down on the shovel and lit a cigarette. The flame caught at last with the third match. His fatigue spread out into a sluggish circle, like India ink dropped in water. It was a jellyfish, a sandbag, a diagram of an atomic nucleus. Some night bird had found a field mouse and was calling to his mate with a weird cry. An uneasy dog bayed deeply. High in the night sky there was a continuous, discordant sound of wind blowing at a different velocity, and on the ground the wind was a knife continually shaving off thin layers of sand. He wiped away the perspiration, blew his nose with his fingers, and brushed the sand from his head. The ripples of the sand at his feet suddenly looked like the motionless crests of waves. Supposing they were sound waves, what kind of music would they give? He wondered. Maybe even a human being could sing such a song. If tongs were driven into his nose and the slimy blood stopped in his ears, if his teeth were broken one by one with hammer blows and splinters jammed into his urethra, if a vulva were cut away and sewn into his eyelids, it might resemble cruelty, and then again it might be a little different. Suddenly his eyes soared upward like a bird, and he felt as he were looking down on himself. Certainly he must be the strangest of all, he who was musing on the strangeness of things here. Got a one-way ticket to the blues. Woo woo. If you want to sing it, sing it. These days people caught in the clutches of a one-way ticket never sing it like that. The souls of those who have only a one-way ticket are so thin that they scream when they step on a pebble. They have had their filling of walking. The round-trip ticket blues is what they want to sing. A one-way ticket is a disjointed life that misses the links between yesterday and today, today and tomorrow. Only the man who obstinately hangs on to a round-trip ticket can hum with real sorrow a song of a one-way ticket. For this very reason he grows desperate lest the return half of his ticket be lost or stolen. He buys stocks, signs up for life insurance, and talks out of different sides of his mouth to his union pals and his superiors. He hums the one-way ticket blues with all his might and, choosing a channel at random, turns the television up to full volume in an attempt to drown out the peevish voices of those who have only a one-way ticket and who keep asking for help. Voices that come up through the bathtub drain or the toilet hole. It would not be strange at all if the round-trip ticket blues were the song of mankind imprisoned. Whenever he could, he stealthily worked at making a rope. He tore his extra shirt into pieces, twisted them together, and then joined them to the kimono stash of the woman's dead husband. Altogether, his rope was now about 5 yards long. When the time came, he would fasten one end to a pair of rusty shears, which he would prop half open with a piece of wood. Of course, the rope was still not long enough. He could almost make the required length if he tied on the hemp clothesline and the rough straw rope, stretched over the earthen floor, on which he had hung some fish and corn to dry. The idea had come to him rather suddenly, but it was not necessarily true that only a time-tested plan would be successful. Such sudden inspiration had sufficient basis in itself, even though the process of its emergence had been unconscious. The chances of success were better in spontaneous cases than with plans that had been fussed over. Now, the question was, when should he put his plan into action? He concluded that the best time for an escape would be during the day, while the woman was asleep. But it would be too risky to cross to the village unless it was dark. He would begin his actions systematically, leaving the place as long a time as possible before the woman awoke, hiding out in some convenient place and waiting there until the sun had set. He would take advantage of the darkness before the moon rose, and it would probably not be too difficult to get out to the main highway where the buses ran. In the meantime, he would use all his skill to get the woman to tell him about the topography and organization of the village. What were the economics of a place like this, which did not have a single fishing boat, although it faced the sea? How long had it been in this condition? What was the population? Who cultivated the tulips, and where? What did the children do? Did they go to a school? If he were to gather together his vague memories of that first day when he had arrived, he could make an approximate map, even though it would be based on indirect information. Ideally, nothing could be better than to escape by detouring around the village and not going through it at all, but the west wall was obstructed by a rather steep promontory, which, although not very high, seemed to have become a sheer cliff, having been eroded away since early times by the waves. Even though there were footholds which the villagers used when they went to gather firewood, they were obstructed by thickets and hard to locate, and then it would be unfortunate to arouse the woman's suspicions by being over-inquisitive. On the opposite side to the east lay a very narrow creek, which was completely surrounded by uninhabited sand dunes rising and falling for more than 5 miles, which led ultimately right back again to the entrance of the village. In other words, the village was a bag of sand, cut off at the neck by the creek and the sheer cliffs. The margin of safety would seem to be greater if he attacked the center, rather than spending precious minutes detouring, thus giving the villagers more time to rally themselves and catch him. But that did not mean that the problem was solved. For example, there was the lookout in the fire tower. He was also worried that the woman, upon noticing his disappearance, might set up a hue and cry that the village gates would be closed before he could get out. Perhaps he could condense the two problems into one. The first basket gang usually came with the water, and the regular deliveries a good while after the sun had set. If the woman tried to report his disappearance before then, She could certainly get through only to the fire lookout. The question came down to just what he should do about the fire guard. Fortunately, owing to the sudden fluctuation of temperature in the region, the surface of the land was shrouded in mist for 30 minutes to an hour before sunset. The reason was apparently that the silicic acid in the sand, which had little capacity to retain heat, suddenly released the warmth it had absorbed during the day. From the fire lookout, the whole area lay precisely at the angle of light reflection, and even with the slight mist, a thick, milk-white curtain completely obstructed the view. He had made certain of this yesterday, just to be on the safe side. At the foot of the cliff toward the sea, he had tried sending a signal by waving his towel a number of times, but just as he had anticipated, there was no response. It was on the fourth day after he had conceived it that the plan was actually carried out. He had decided on Saturday evening, which was the usual time the bath water was delivered. The preceding night he had determined to get a full night's sleep by pretending to have a cold. For precaution's sake, he had insisted that they fetch him some aspirin. The tablets were discolored, apparently shop-worn from their sojourn in the local emporium. He took 2 along with some of the cheap sake. The results were immediate. Until the woman returned from her work, he had heard nothing except the sounds of the lift basket being raised and lowered. The woman, who had not had to work by herself for some time, understandably bore signs of great fatigue. As she busied herself with the preparation of the meal, he chatted idly about all sorts of things. The sink, which had been in bad condition for a long time, should be repaired, and so on. He could see that she was thinking that his selfishness was a sign that he was putting down roots here, and she dared not register irritation lest she destroy his mood. Now, after work, anyone should feel like taking a bath. The sand that clung to the skin with the night's perspiration was especially annoying. Not only was it the day for delivery of the bath water, but the woman especially liked to wash him and would surely not put up any objection. As he was being soaped and pretended to be aroused and pulled at her kimono, he would wash her in return. Caught between confusion and expectancy, she made a gesture of resistance, but it was not clear just what she was resisting. He quickly poured a bucket of warm water over her naked body, and without a washcloth began to pass his soapy hands directly over her skin. He started with the earlobes and shifted down to the jaw, and as he passed over her shoulders he reached around and with one hand grasped her breast. She cried out, and sliding down his chest crouched level with his stomach. Undoubtedly it was a posture of expectation, but the man was in no hurry. With measured cadence, his hands went on with their painstaking massaging from one part of her body to another. The woman's excitement naturally infected him, too. He felt a strange sadness that was different from usual. The woman was glowing from within now, as if she were being washed by a wave of fireflies. To disappoint her now would be like suddenly shooting a freed criminal from behind, and so he reacted with even greater frenzy, spurring on his awakening senses. But there is a limit to perverted passion, too. The woman, who had been entreating him at first, manifested obvious fright at this frenzy. He was seized by a feeling of prostration, as if he had ejaculated. Again he spurred his courage, forcing himself on by a series of helter-skelter lewd fantasies, arousing his passion by biting her breasts and striking her body, which, with the soap, sweat, and sand, felt like machine oil mixed with iron filings. He had intended to let this go on for at least 2 hours, but finally the woman gritted her teeth and, complaining of pain, crouched away from him. He mounted her from behind like a rabbit and finished up within seconds. Then he threw water over her to wash up the soap. He forced her to drink a teacupful of the cheap sake along with 3 aspirin tablets. She would sleep straight on through without awakening until night, and, if things went well, until she was awakened by the cries from the basket gangs. In her sleep, the woman breathed as if paper wad had been stuck in her nose. Her respirations were deep and long. He tapped her heel lightly with his foot, but she showed almost no change. She was an old tube squeezed dry of all sex. He fixed the towel, which had almost slipped off her face, and pulled her kimono down around her knees, seeing that it had twisted like a rope around her waist. Fortunately, he was completely occupied with the final arrangements of his plan, and there was no time for sentimentality. When he had finished working on the device he had contrived with the old shears, it was just about the anointed moment. As he had expected, he felt a kind of lacerating pain as he looked at her for the last time. A thin light played in a circle about a yard from the upper lip of the hole. It must be between 6:30 and 20 of 7. The time was just right. He forced both arms back with all his strength and turned his neck to and fro, stretching the kinks out his shoulder muscles. First he had to climb to the top of the roof. In grappling, the chances of success are greater the closer the angle of elevation is to 45 degrees. He would have liked to climb up on the roof using the rope, but he was afraid the woman might be awakened by the sound of the shears striking the shingles. He decided to eliminate the testing and to circle around back of the house and climb up the roof using as footholds the vestiges of a rain shelter that seemed once to have been used as a place for drying clothes. The squared timbers were thin and half rotten, and they worried him, but what came next was even worse. The flying sand had polished the straight white grain on the roof, making it appear like new, but when he climbed up on it, it was as soft as a soaked cracker. If he were to put his foot through it, it would be trouble. He dispersed his weight, crawling slowly forward. Finally, he reached the ridgepole and, straddling it, raised himself on his knees. The top of the roof was already in the shadows, and the faint, honey-colored granulations on the west edge of the hole were signs that the mist was gradually beginning to come in. He no longer need concern himself with the lookout in the tower. He tied the rope into a lasso, and, holding it in his right hand about a yard below the shears, swung it in a circle around his head. His target was one of the sandbags that were used instead of a pulley when they raised and lowered the baskets. Since the bag could hold the rope ladder, they must surely be quite firmly buried. Gradually, he increased the speed of the revolutions and, taking aim, let fly with the loop. It sailed off in a completely unexpected direction. His idea of casting was wrong. The shears had to fly in a tangent to the circumference of the hole, and so he would have to let go at the very instant the rope was at right angles with the target, or maybe a bare instant before. Yes, that was it. But the next time, the shears unfortunately struck the middle of the cliff and fell to the ground. It would seem that the speed of the revolutions and the angle of elevation as he held the rope were not right. After repeated tries, he managed to establish both the distance and the angle pretty well, but still there was a long way to go before a real strike. He would have been happy at any sign of progress, but still there was no evidence that the margin of error was lessening. Indeed, to the contrary, his aim was becoming terribly erratic with fatigue and impatience. Perhaps he had oversimplified. He felt unreasonably angry and close to tears, as though someone had actually deceived him. Yet there seemed to be some truth in the law of probability, according to which the chance of success is directly proportionate to the number of repetitions. With something like the 30th try, when in despair he had given up hope, the rope flew straight over the bags. The inside of his mouth felt prickly, and even though he kept swallowing, the saliva kept welling up. But it was still too soon to be pleased with himself. He had simply got hold of money with which to buy a lottery ticket. He would see now whether he would win or lose. All his nerves strained toward the rope as he drew it gently towards him, as if he were pulling up stars with a strand of spider's web. It resisted. At first, he could not believe it, but the rope actually did not move. He tried exerting more pressure. His body was poised, waiting for the moment of disillusion. Was it to be now? Or now? But there was no longer any room for doubt. The hook improvised from the shears had bitten firmly into the bags. What luck! What unbelievable luck! From this minute on, things would really go in his favor. With a giddy heart, he got down from the roof and walked to where the end of the rope, now hanging perpendicular, was gently shaving away at the sand cliff. Ground level was right there. So near, he could scarcely believe it. His face was stiff and his lips trembled. Columbus's egg must have been hard-boiled. Keep it hot too long, though, and it would spoil. He grasped the rope and slowly began hoisting himself. Suddenly it began to stretch as if it were rubber. He was startled, and the perspiration gushed from his pores. Fortunately, the stretching stopped after about a foot. He tried bringing all his weight to bear, and this time there seemed to be no further cause for worry. He spit on his hands, fitted the rope between his legs, and began to climb hand over hand. He rose like a toy monkey climbing a toy coconut tree. Perhaps it was his excitement, but the perspiration on his forehead felt strangely cold. In an effort to keep the sand from falling on him, he avoided brushing against it and depended solely on the rope. But he felt uneasy as his body turned around and round in the air. The dead weight of his torso was more than he had anticipated, and his progress was slow. And whatever was this trembling? His arms had begun to jerk in spite of him, and he felt almost as if he were snapping himself like a whip. Perhaps it was a natural reaction, in view of those 46 horrible days. When he had climbed a yard, the hole seemed 100 yards deep. 2 yards, 200 yards deep. Gradually, as the depth of the hole increased, he began to be dizzy. He was too tired. He mustn't look down. But there was the surface where no matter which way he went, he would walk to freedom, to the very ends of the earth. When he got to the surface, this endless moment would become a small flower pressed between the pages of his diary. Poisonous herb or carnivorous plant, it would be no more than a bit of half-transparent colored paper. And, as he sipped his tea in the parlor, he would hold it up to the light and take pleasure in telling its story. And now he hadn't the slightest intention of accusing the woman any more. He could definitely guarantee that if she wasn't exactly a lady, she was also not a prostitute. If she needed any backing later, he would gladly guarantee it, as much as she wanted. She was a stupid creature whose only merit was that she clung to a round-trip ticket, like him. But even with the same round-trip ticket, if the point of departure was different, the destination was naturally different too. It would not be particularly strange, in fact, if his return ticket were to be her ticket out. Even suppose, for the time being, that she had made a mistake. After all, a mistake was a mistake. Don't look down. He mustn't look down. A mountain climber, a window cleaner on some skyscraper, an electrician atop a television tower, a trapeze artist in a circus, a chimney sweep on a factory smokestack. The instant of his destruction was the instant he looked down.